Whatever happened to Raijin? Raijin's introduction into Smite as well as his development throughout the patches was a pretty wild ride. When Raijin came out, he was originally considered very strong based on his damage values. He had all the damage in the world between all his abilities. He was very strong in most casuals early on, he was performing very well, and people were really skeptical when he got released into ranked without any major changes. The only change that Raijin received pretty early on was a change in patch 3.4, where his percussive storm was fixed. This had an issue or a bug where it would apply 2 procs of Soul Reaver instead of 1, which was obviously pretty devastating if it hit you. Other than that, the only complaint that people had, me among them, was that his kit was relatively clunky, but at the same time his damage numbers felt so strong that they kinda made up for it. Because of that, Raijin obviously made a debut into the pro scene as well, where he was picked up quite a lot early on. What the pros had to realize very quickly is while his kit sounds fine on paper, it has some significant downsides, mainly in the fact that his escape can be so easily interrupted. With Thunder Crash not being a reliable escape, many pros would just take the advantage of that, abuse that and focus him down the moment he tried to escape by locking him down out of his escape with any form of CC. This then obviously translated into the more casual scene as well, and while to some extent he was still very strong because counterplaying him there was a lot harder, he was still considered a lot weaker than before without any changes to his numbers. And bear in mind, this was even though he was able to pretty much insta-gib enemies with a 2-3 or 2-4 combo if they were a little squishy, and he would be able to single them out. Yet still, because of his clunkiness, the buffs came in. The buffs in 3.8 were quite numerous. First of all, his percussive storm was buffed. This received a projectile speed increase from 100 to 115, making it a little easier to hit, and at the same time a little nerf that made it interruptible by silence. Thunder Crash got the biggest change here, and this is a major change that still upsets people to this day actually. Thunder Crash previously, as pointed out, used to be interruptible very easily because of the long delay where Raijin would basically just stand there being an open target for anyone to shoot. Now, the collision during his pre-fire was entirely removed, meaning he would not get hit by anything. Raijin would also no longer be able to be stunned, silenced, etc. out of this ability at all once he becomes invisible, which was pretty much right after the ability went off. Thunder Crash itself, not factoring in the previous possibility to CC Raijin out of it, has very little counterplay as it is an ability that's considered a leap but doesn't really function like a leap, so even a Willish can't really pull him out of it, so pretty much no ability can stop him from using it properly unless he's already under CC beforehand. And then the last change was a buff to Taiko Drums, because the pros figured out that, hey, Raijin does a lot of damage during Taiko Drums, but he's also not as tanky as people thought. He's not being built tanky, he's very squishy most of the time, and he is very vulnerable by using it. He's super slow, and he's very much just standing there trying to get this ability off. So he was just focused out. In return, he now got buffs to that. The time in air was increased from 3 to 4.5 seconds, giving him more time to aim the ability and choose whichever sort of ability you'd like to use, like which sort of CC or just pure damage, as well as increasing his movement speed. He previously had a movement speed penalty of 75%, pretty much making him sit in place. This was reduced to 40%, allowing him to move around and dodge abilities much better while in the ultimate. What that led to shouldn't really surprise anyone. Raijin was a strong mage in terms of damage before, and a lot of his clunkiness was now removed, which then made him one of the strongest mages in the game, if not the strongest. He just had potential in every regard, he had a very safe escape, he had a very strong ultimate, and he had a crazy amount of damage between all his abilities. So, what we saw next were quite a few nerfs. The first one was in version 3.10. Thunder Crash was nerfed, the base damage on the lightning was reduced from up to 60 to up to 40, and the thunder damage, the second instance, was reduced from up to 120 to up to 80. This took away a significant amount of base damage from Thunder Crash, just making it a less strong ability than before, to call it that, but still a strong ability overall. What was targeted next were Raijin's protections. In patch 3.12, his magical base protections were increased from 25 to 30, but in return, all magical protection scaling was removed from the character, giving him less magical protection throughout the match overall, meaning less defense in general. This was due to the fact that initially he was kinda released as a more bruisery mage and had these scalings, which he never really turned out needing because he was played more like a burst mage than anything else. Keep in mind that even after these nerfs, he was still considered strong. Raijin had very high early pressure, especially because around that time you could still get red buff before the wave, and around some of that time you were able to get a pot early in the game that would allow you to get even more pressure. A Raijin with red pot and red buff was nothing to joke about. His early clear was immense, you could pretty much instant clear, and then pressure you, clear jungle camps very early on his own, and so on. As a matter of fact, on the 21st of September, Leo Firegod made a post on Reddit that was actually pretty highly upvoted regarding Raijin's current performance, where he was still considered very, very strong. He had very positive stats as well as a high win rate, and this was around the time where quite some other gods were considered very, very strong. Then 3.18 came. This patch brought yet another nerf to Raijin. This time, Reiju was targeted, decreasing the base damage from up to 260 to up to 220, and Thunder Crash received a nerf as well, reducing the scaling on the damage from the Thunder from 40% to 20%, so 20% scaling off. This did not immediately kill off Raijin, but it basically started his downfall. He was seeing less and less play as his damage numbers were just not quite matching with other gods anymore, and then with the introduction of Season 4, he got bigger issues. His level 1 presence significantly fell off. There were no longer pots that you could buy early in the game, and he wouldn't get red buff on level 1 anymore. With that, there were a lot of other mages that you could just do better on level 1, where he excelled previously. With 2 players often being in mid for the first wave, it was actually possible to body block his first wave clear completely by just being in the wave with both players and taking the hits off his 1, basically making him one of the weakest level 1 clears in the mid lane. Overall, especially with other mages receiving buffs or performing better in the meta, there was just not much of a reason to pick him anymore, and his effectiveness didn't really increase enough throughout the game to justify picking him for later. Raijin was always an early presence god that then snowballed out of control. With his current state, that's not really possible because the early snowball will almost never happen anymore. Especially because fights in middle lane just look different from what they used to. The most favorable metas for Raijin are those where he is left alone in middle, builds up pressure against another middle laner, and then sees rotations later, but that's hardly ever the case these days. Instead, the rotations are all focused around rotating together from minute 1. It wouldn't be impossible to bring Raijin back into the meta, but changes have to be carefully made because people still dislike the interaction of his 3 and how it basically gives him a free out of jail card. And as long as that's the case, it's gonna be hard to give him major buffs in regards to his damage, because then he could easily go out of control again. With that, thank you guys for watching. I hope this was informative, I hope this was insightful. If you enjoyed this, feel free to click the sub button and maybe the bell, it really helps me out. See you for the next one tomorrow. Duke Sloth, out.